Okay, so, sometimes I feel like I've got this wall in my brain, like all the
Uh-huh.
information's in there, right? But when I try to get it out in English, especially, it's like hitting a brick wall.
Well, tell me about it. I think we've all been there.
Yeah.
And it can be especially frustrating when you know you understand the language.
Exactly. And that's what's got me so intrigued by this deep dive, all these articles you've sent in about spoken fluency. It's like, what's the deal with this disconnect between our brains and our mouths?
Well, the articles really dig into that, and one of the key takeaways is that speaking a language is a totally different skill set than understanding it.
Yeah.
Reading, listening, those are passive skills.
Hmm.
But speaking, that's game time.
Yeah, it's like the difference between watching a cooking show and actually having to make the dish, right?
100%.
Yeah.
And with speaking, you've got that added pressure of real-time processing. No pausing, no editing.
Right. And the articles called this out specifically, the no luxury of pausing problem. It's like you said, with reading or even writing, you can take your time, but speaking, it's like you're on a moving train and you've got to keep up or get left behind.
And that's where things get really interesting from a cognitive perspective. Because your brain is working overtime when you're speaking. It's pulling up vocabulary, figuring out grammar, monitoring pronunciation, and trying to read the room all at the same time.
Wow. No wonder it feels like such a workout sometimes. It's like our brains are doing mental gymnastics while trying to hold a conversation.
Exactly. And it's not just about feeling nervous or self-conscious, although those things play a role too. The articles emphasize that there's a significant cognitive load involved in speaking, even for native speakers.
Okay, that makes me feel a little better, knowing it's not just me being weird. But seriously, it is fascinating to think about all that's happening in our brains when we're just trying to chat with someone in English.
Right. And this is where understanding the science behind it can be so empowering. Because once you realize that speaking is a skill that can be trained and improved just like any other, it takes some of the pressure off.
Absolutely. So it's not about being born a natural talker, it's about putting in the work to develop that fluency muscle.
Precisely. And the great news is the articles you sent in have some fantastic tips on how to do just that. But we'll dive into those after a quick break. Stay tuned.
You know what really struck me when I was reading these articles? It's not just about the words themselves. It's like there's this whole other layer of musicality to spoken English.
Totally. Rhythm and intonation, they're like the unsung heroes of fluency.
Right. Like you can tell when someone's got the grammar down, they've got a decent vocabulary, but something just sounds a little doff.
Exactly. It's like they're missing the beat of the language. And native speakers, we pick up on that instinctively, even if we can't always put it into words.
It's true. And I think that's where things can get especially tricky for English learners because, on top of everything else, English is not exactly, what do they call it, phonetic.
Oh, tell me about it. You can't always look at a word and know how to pronounce it.
Right. Like, how do you explain read versus lead versus bleed to someone who's just starting out?
It's enough to make your head spin. And then you throw in regional accents and dialects, and it's a whole other ballgame.
It's no wonder some people feel intimidated by spoken English. But okay, so we've got the real-time processing pressure, we've got the rhythm and intonation game, we've got the fact that spelling and pronunciation don't always play nice. Anything else we should add to this recipe for disaster? I'm kidding. Sort of.
Well, actually, yes, there's one more ingredient in the mix, and the articles called this out, specifically the impact of who you're talking to. They called it the interlocutor effect.
Interesting. So, like, how does that work exactly?
Well, think about it.
Yeah.
Do you speak the same way to everyone?
Oh gosh, no. Like, if I'm being honest, sometimes I feel like I've got a different personality for every situation, especially when it comes to speaking English.
Exactly. And that's totally normal. Our brains are wired to adapt our communication style depending on who we're interacting with.
Okay, so it's not just in my head, there's actually something going on at a neurological level here. That's kind of wild.
It is. And the article suggested that this is part of what makes speaking, in general, so demanding because our brains aren't just processing language. They're processing social cues, power dynamics, all sorts of subtle things that influence how we express ourselves.
So, like, if you're talking to someone you find intimidating, your brain's basically hitting the panic button at the same time it's trying to form sentences.
Pretty much. And that's why it's so important to create a supportive and encouraging environment for language learning and practice, because when we feel safe and comfortable, our brains are able to focus on the task at hand without all that extra noise.
That makes a lot of sense. So how do we actually put this into practice? Because I think a lot of people listening are probably nodding their heads right now, relating to that feeling of like, okay, I know what I want to say, but the words just won't come out.
Right, and that's where those practical tips I mentioned come in. And one of the most surprising ones, honestly, was the emphasis on not just speaking as much as possible, but being really deliberate about the kind of practice you're doing.
Ooh, tell me more about that. Because I think a lot of times the advice is just like speak, 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 but it sounds like these articles are taking a different approach.
They are. And we'll dive into all of that right after this.
Okay, so we're back and ready to talk solutions because let's be real, everyone wants to know the secret to unlocking fluency, right?
Right. Everyone wants that magic pill.
But the articles you sent, they actually had a refreshing take on this. Like, they weren't about quick fixes, more about building sustainable habits. Yeah, and one of the things that surprised me was they cautioned against just focusing on quantity over, like just racking up hours of speaking practice.
It's so true. It's like anything else we're trying to learn. Quality over quantity almost always wins, right?
100%. So what did they recommend instead?
Well, one of the first things they emphasized was being really deliberate about the kind of speaking practice you're doing. It's not just about talking more, it's about talking better.
Oh, okay. That makes a lot of sense. So it's like being strategic with your practice time rather than just winging it.
That's it. And they gave a really interesting example. They talked about learning correct phrases as a foundation.
Oh, like instead of just trying to cobble together sentences word by word, learning those chunks of language that native speakers use naturally.
Exactly. It's like giving your brain a set of building blocks that it can then use to create more complex structures.
Yeah.
And speaking of building blocks, the next tip was all about pronunciation.
Music to my ears, because that's something I've always struggled with. Like, even if I can say a word correctly in isolation, as soon as it's part of a sentence, it's like my tongue goes on strike.
Uh-huh. I think we've all been there. But the articles had some really practical advice for this. They suggested breaking down words into syllables.
Oh, that's a good one. Like, instead of trying to tackle a whole word at once, just focusing on those smaller chunks of sound.
Exactly. And they even recommended recording yourself saying those syllables, listening back, comparing it to how a native speaker says it, and just, really getting those sounds ingrained in your mind and your mouth.
It sounds almost like a musical exercise, like training your ears and your vocal cords to work together.
It totally is. And speaking of music, the articles also highlighted the importance of listening, really, really listening to native speakers.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Like immersing yourself in the sounds of the language as much as possible.
Precisely. And they even suggested trying to mimic those native speakers. Not in a creepy way, of course.
Haha, right. Not like you're trying to steal their identity. More like paying attention to their rhythm, their intonation, and trying to incorporate some of those elements into your own speech.
Exactly. Because the more you expose yourself to the sounds of natural, fluent English, the more your brain starts to internalize those patterns, and it becomes easier to replicate them.
It's like anything else. The more you practice, the better you get,
Yeah.
right? But I think there's another layer to this whole speaking thing, and the articles touched on this too. It's the emotional side of things.
Oh, absolutely. You can have all the tools and techniques in the world, but if you're filled with fear and self-doubt, it's going to be really hard to let go and speak freely.
It's true. It's like your brain knows what to do, but your mouth's too scared to do it. So how do we overcome that fear?
Well, the articles had some really interesting advice for this, and one of the things they suggested was practicing self-talk.
Wait, really? Talking to yourself, like out loud.
Yes, they said it's a great way to create a safe space to practice, where there's no judgment, no pressure, just you and the language.
I can see how that would be helpful, like a low stakes environment to experiment with different sounds and phrases.
Exactly. And they even recommended recording yourself during those self-talk sessions, just to get used to the sound of your own voice speaking English.
That's a really good point because sometimes I think we're our own worst critics, right? So hearing ourselves speak in a more objective way can actually be really helpful.
Exactly. And it helps to build that confidence, which is like 90% of the battle when it comes to speaking fluently.
So true. So we've got mimicking native speakers, breaking down pronunciation, practicing self-talk. What else? Because I know there was more. These articles were packed with good stuff.
They were. Oh, they also talked about the power of repetition.
Right, because even with all these other tips and tricks, ultimately there's no substitute for just putting in the time and effort consistently.
Exactly. And they even suggested finding an accountability partner, someone you can practice with regularly, whether it's a language exchange partner,
Yeah.
a tutor, or even just a friend who's also learning English.
Right, because there's something about having that social connection that makes the learning process more enjoyable and motivating, right?
Totally. And I think that's a perfect note to end on because ultimately learning to speak English fluently, it's not just about memorizing grammar rules or vocabulary words. It's about connecting with other human beings.
It's about being able to share your thoughts, your ideas, your stories with the world, and that's something worth striving for, no matter how challenging it might seem at times. So keep practicing, stay curious, and never be afraid to make mistakes because that's how we learn and grow. And on that note, that's a wrap on today's deep dive. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating exploration of language and learning.